you want to unmute, you can ask your question or you can type it in the chat box, which I know a lot of you are familiar with by now. So I will start by introducing our guest tonight, Connie Hertzberg Mayo, who grew up in Westchester County, but moved to Massachusetts to get a literature degree from Tufts University and never ended up leaving. Her first book, The Island of Worthy Boys, was published in 2015 by She Writes Press, and it won the 2016 Gold Medal for Best Regional Fiction in the Independent Publisher Book Awards. Connie's short story, Little Breaks, was published by Calyx Journal in 2017, and her latest novel, The Sharp Edge of Mercy, was published by Heliotrope Books just last month of this year. Connie works as a systems analyst and empty nests with her husband and 2 feuding cats. So please join me in welcoming Connie Hertzberg Mayo.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Yes, I grew up in Tarrytown and was in the same house in Tarrytown all my life till I went off to Tufts as an undergraduate. So I'm a Westchester County girl. So glad to be here virtually. My book, Sharp Edge of Mercy, as Giovanna said, just came out just exactly a month ago now. So usually when I give this type of presentation, I talk about, the origin. A lot of people ask me, like, what was the inspiration for the book? So that's usually where I start. So this book was inspired by an episode of a podcast called 99% Invisible, which is about design, largely about architecture, also about other design issues. And so I listened to it. I'm a big fan of architecture. I'm sort of an architecture nerd. And there was an episode called Castle on the Park, which was about the very interesting, architecturally interesting building that was the New York Cancer Hospital, which was built around the turn of the century. And you can see from this picture, and I have a couple other pictures, that it does have a really interesting architecture. It has these round turrets, and then there's this connecting piece, which isn't exactly round. So we'll sort of talk about that in a minute. So here is a picture of the hospital as it was originally built, which was in the 1880s. So this is 1893. And here's a picture of it today on Central Park West. It's about, if you're familiar with Manhattan geography, it's about at 105th Street. And I was very excited to be able to find a picture that was taken at the exact same angle as the picture from 1893. So you can really see how well it's been preserved, except of course, this is high rise behind it, which may or may not actually be part of this building, but this building is now fancy condos. Which I have some pictures of that as well. But in the 1890s, it was the first cancer hospital in the country and the second cancer hospital in the world. The first was in London. And so it has this unique architecture to it, which I think is French Renaissance. And but it was built specifically to be a hospital. And you can see here's a blueprint of one of the turrets, one of those round structures. And you can see that these are the wards where there were hospital beds that were arranged like spokes on a wheel, also your feet all pointing towards this central column, which was for ventilation. And so this was a very specific design for the hospital. They felt that round rooms didn't have corners for dirt and germs to accumulate. And as you'll see in the next picture, there were a lot of windows, and there was this central ventilation shaft. I'll actually show you. So this is one of the only 2 pictures I could find of the interior of the hospital from around the turn of the century. So all of the beds pointed towards the central ventilation shaft. They had these tall ceilings. They had these tall windows where light would come in. And so this was thought to be this was progressive architecture for medical care at the time. So, the other slide that I could, or another photo that I could find of the interior of the hospital during this era was of the operating room. And it was very typical of operating rooms to be on the top floor of hospitals at the time, because this hospital, like many other hospitals, did not have electricity when it was first built. It had gas fixtures, which did not burn very brightly. And so a lot of times operating rooms were at the top of a building so that they could take advantage of the natural light while they were doing surgery. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner that there's a skylight there to sort of let in some of the natural light. So the building had this middle piece, as I talked about, which was the chapel that connected some of these round structures. And it's now, as I said, fancy condos. And here's a picture of what I believe is actually somebody's living room. And when I first saw this, I thought, oh, this must be like the lobby or a public space related to this condo complex. But I'm pretty sure that this is actually somebody's living room, which used to be the chapel. So it's been restored to its original grandeur, as was common to build. So this hospital was built with funds donated by John Jacob Astor III. And what was typical when a public institution was completely privately funded, it was typical at the time for it to be very sort of grandiose. And if any of you are familiar with buildings like the Boston Public Library, which is also built around the same time, it's very, very elegant in a way that public buildings are not built anymore. So there was this fancy chapel, and there's another picture. This is, I believe, somebody's dining room, and you can see the elaborate woodwork on this crazy spiral staircase. So very swanky now, but used to be the chapel for the hospital. So I had to learn a lot about the state of medical care, cancer care at this time. And it turns out, this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but that cancer outcomes were not good in the 1890s. And a lot of it was because they really didn't have a lot of tools. So they didn't have radiation treatment, was sort of close, 10 years away, not really, certainly didn't have chemotherapy. They were closest to having X-ray as diagnostics, but at the time that my book is written, which is 1890, it was still 5 years away before X-rays were being used diagnostically. MRI, of course, many years away. And very importantly, they did not have antibiotics, and that was a full 40 years away until antibiotics were able to be used in like a post-surgical situation. So that was, they had a lot of strikes against them when they were trying to treat cancer back then. And in addition, the scientific knowledge about treating disease, about what disease was evolving. And for a very, very long time, disease theory was based on something called the miasma theory, which was that disease was caused by bad air, which came from rotting organic matter, which meant that disease could be identified by having a foul smell. And I've read this, and I know this is true, but it is a little puzzling why they couldn't figure out that not all disease has a foul smell, but or was caused by something that had a foul smell. But that was a prevailing theory until around the 1880s, when germ theory was developed, which is our current theory, which is that disease is caused by microorganisms. So since my book is written in the era is 1890, most people were embracing germ theory, but not everybody. There were some holdouts. And so that also made it very challenging to do surgery, to treat disease, to treat cancer at this time, because not everybody had even fully bought into germ theory. So in order to treat cancer, we really had two tools in the toolbox. And one of them was the knife, the scalpel. And I hope that they were cleaner than these ones, these antique scalpels were, but no promises, right? And the other tool that they had was ether and anesthetic. And so ether was first used as an anesthetic at Mass General Hospital in something that's currently called the Ether Dome. And you can actually go there, and I would recommend it, but it's sort of hard to find because it's sort of in the bowels of Mass General Hospital, and you have to go in these very narrow hallways and these like little cinder block. There's a tray of instruments, and you're walking by a fire extinguisher, and there's a little door, and then you open it up, and you are immediately transported. It's like going through the looking glass, and you see this picture on the left, which is this beautifully restored operating theater where they first used anesthesia. And there's a painting commemorating it. That's my husband and me next to this very gory painting of the first surgery that was done using ether. So they took some tumor out of some guy's neck. So that was a really great advance for surgery and for cancer treatment in specific. But in my research, I also learned that anesthetics like ether and the other anesthetics at the time that they knew about in the 1800s were nitrous oxide, otherwise known as laughing gas, and chloroform. And the sort of medical community knew about the properties of all of these things, but they didn't use them for anesthesia during surgery. But mostly what these somewhat newly discovered chemicals were used for was just partying, which I could not believe. But there is lots of documentation about how young male, always male, medical doctors would experiment on themselves with these chemicals, and would literally bring them to parties, and they would have ether frolics, and they would usually ether, but in this drawing depicts a chloroform. I don't know if it's a party or an experimentation. So, and it was actually several decades where the medical community knew about these chemicals, but did not quite put it together that they would be really good to use as anesthesia during surgery, which seems really baffling, but yet there it is. So it was a big party drug before they learned to use it for surgery. So I had to learn a lot about the state of cancer treatment and surgery, but then I also needed to know a little bit more about the hospital in specific that I was going to write about. So I would say most historical authors really like the research phase, and I really like the research trip associated with the research phase. And so my trip brought me to Sleepy Hollow, brought me back home, which was a big surprise because this hospital, which was on Central Park West in the 50s, moved to the east side of Manhattan and became Sloan Kettering. So the New York Cancer Hospital was a precursor to Sloan Kettering. And so I assumed that when I went to go find where the archives were for the New York Cancer Hospital, I assumed they'd be in Manhattan. I assumed they'd be at Sloan Kettering in some dusty basement with some fluorescent lighting and a few mice. And that's where I was sort of bracing myself to go. And then I found out that the archives for the hospital were actually in Sleepy Hollow, where I went to high school. So that was great and a much easier trip for me to make. And I also got to go to this beautiful building. You can see the lobby there is gorgeous. And so being sort of an architecture nerd, I was much happier than being in a basement with mice. So that was great. So I was able to look at a lot of things, including some of the surgical notes that they were probably handwritten at the time, but then several decades later, maybe like in the 30s or 40s, they were typed up and they had these microfiche of the surgical notes. And so I have a couple of them for your entertainment. So one of the early ones, so somebody was admitted in 1888 with endometriosis, and they stayed 2 days, and patient has been complaining about the food and making impertinent remarks to nurses and house surgeon, discharged 2 days later, unimproved and insubordinate. So I guess if you complain about the food, you don't get treated for your endometriosis. So I don't know how that person fared, but that was not great. So I guess the surgeons had a lot of power at that time. And the other interesting one I pulled out was somebody who had cancer of the breast and had a radical operation, which is probably a double mastectomy. And then one evening they go to the bathroom and they faint, and they're brought in poor condition, and they were given whiskey by mouth and hypodermic, and then she dies. And so I bring this up because if you read the book, there is what I learned that they would actually give whiskey through a hypodermic needle. I just figured I have to put that in the book because that's just interesting. So I just wanted you to know that I did not make that up. That's not the type of detail that I would make up because I don't think anybody would believe it, but I saw it in black and white. So I decided that it had to be part of my book. And I guess a whiskey was given hypodermically when somebody was just on the verge of dying. I guess it was sort of a Hail Mary pass or something. So evidently did not work in this case. So after I did all this research, I had to actually finally start writing and have an actual story. And so my story is that Lillian, who's a young 19-year-old girl, starts work at the beginning of the book at the New York Cancer Hospital. And she eventually develops two problems at this job. And one of them is with a patient. And so she has some medical ethical issues with this patient. And she also has a separate problem with a doctor who, which is sort of a gender power imbalance / Me Too story. And then there are other characters dealing with other things. Lillian has a disabled sister that she is caring for. She has a cousin that she worships, and there's some other people. And So when I was balancing all of these characters, my previous book mostly just had two characters and they had alternating point of view chapters. And so it was pretty easy, write one chapter about one character, then you write another chapter about the other character and you go back and forth. So, you're sort of giving them fair time. But I had all these characters and I was afraid that I was neglecting some of them. So being an analyst, what I did to solve my problem was I made a spreadsheet. So, and I like, even at work, I like to color my spreadsheets. And so this is how I kept track of everything. So every column represents a day, and you can see that there's some days where nothing happens at the hospital or nothing happens to Lillian that you know about. But every day I can tell what day of the week it is, and the colors represent different characters. And so you can see that the doctor, Dr. Bauer, he doesn't come in until chapter 10, he's orange. And so I could tell, I think Marie is pink. And so if I go for too long without, dealing with Marie and reminding my reader about Lillian's sister, I can see that from a color perspective. And then I can think, okay, I got to work Marie into the next chapter in some way, because I have to sort of remind my reader, yes, she has a sister she's caring for. So this is how I kept track of everything. So, and it worked for me. I don't know if it worked for other people. So originally, the original vision for the story was that Lillian would have, I wanted to write a book about medical ethics, which is why I was so interested in the New York Cancer Hospital. I figured cancer treatment, turn of the century, is going to be a great fertile ground for dealing for a story that's related to medical ethics. And I knew there would be other characters in the story, of course, but that the main issue here would be that Lillian would struggle with these ethical issues. But what ended up happening is that it ended up really being a dual themed book, at least, where the original vision persisted, but the story, I didn't really even think there would be a story related to the surgeon. I just figured there would be an arrogant surgeon because it's turn of the century. And of course, there's going to be male surgeons, and of course, they're going to be arrogant. But as I was writing the book, and you can see that I originally started writing it in 2017, I'm also reading the news, and there is just more and more stories, Me Too stories, Me Too hashtag, and so forth. And so, starting with Harvey Weinstein, but there's many others. And then, so this aspect of the book really sort of elbowed its way in with its sharp elbows and really insisted that it be a part of this book. It's sort of, I don't want to say it wrote itself, but it's sort of, the story sort of took over a little bit. And so it ended up being equally about this relationship with the surgeon as it is about Lillian's relationship with this patient. And another thing that happened, another piece that's new in the sort of eventual vision is Lillian's friend Jupiter, who is African-American, and he runs the crematorium. There was a crematorium at this hospital. And the reason that he appears is because I learned something else as I was studying about this hospital that I knew that I needed to fit into the story, which was J. Marion Sims, which some of you may have heard of him. He is sometimes called the father of modern gynecology, or the father of gynecology, because he developed and perfected a surgery to correct something called fistula, which I won't go into because it's sort of gross, but it happens to women. It's an affliction that happens to women who've been through childbirth. And Dr. Sims perfected this surgery that nobody else had really been able to perfect. And he was able to perform it on lots of people and make a lot of women much happier. However, when he was busy perfecting this surgery, which took a lot of trial and error, he was doing this in Alabama in the 1840s, I think. And he was doing this on slave women, not his slaves, but other people's slave women, without anesthesia, even though anesthesia was available. It's not, in his writings, he doesn't specifically address why he does this. It's definitely confirmed that he did this, but not really why he did this. But there was a thought going around at the time that African Americans did not feel pain to the same extent as white people. And so that may have figured into it. So he has this very dubious past, and you can see that there was this statue of him in Central Park, very near to where the hospital was and now where the condos are. And it was removed in 2018, somewhat inspired by Black Lives Matter movement. There was a lot of protests about having a statue of this man in Central Park. And so the statue has been removed, but I think the granite piece on the bottom is still there if you want to go see it. So, he was a founder of this hospital. And I thought, okay, easy. He will be a character in my book. He's a founder of the hospital, very easy to work him in there. And he has this very dubious sort of medical ethics, piece of his history. And so that'll be great for a book that's largely about medical ethics. The only problem was I discovered that he died before the hospital actually opened. And so so ultimately the way that I worked his story into the book is through the character of Jupiter, who's the crematorium worker. And I won't tell you exactly how he's connected, but that is why I ended up with the character of Jupiter, so that I could talk about this sort of semi-horrible guy. So another thing I like to do in these presentations is talk about the evolution of the book cover. When I was writing the book and I was imagining it would be published someday, I actually sort of hacked together what I thought maybe the book cover should look like. And the one thing that I really wanted to be on the cover, which didn't end up being on the cover, is you can sort of see this woman's hat. They had this very specific cap, this frilly cap that they would wear, and it's very. If you look at a picture of a nurse from the 40s or the 50s, they have a very different, the classic sort of Red Cross nurse's cap with the thing across the top. There's a very different look. And so I thought it was very iconic that this is sort of the turn of the century nurse look. So I thought, oh, it'd be great to have one of these hats, which they used to call a cupcake because it's sort of that shape. And if anybody has ever seen the show The Nick, which is on Cinemax, which is a great show and has a lot of similarities to my book.
Hi, Joyce.
This is Clive Owen as the
numbers, no shortcuts.
Yeah.
We ask that you stay muted during the presentation.
That you have.
Okay.
There you go. This is a Clive Owen, but I recommend this show a lot, especially if you like the book. You would really like this show, but I just want to show this amazing hat. They had some great costumes here. So in my quest for a good photo for the cover, I found this photo, which I loved. And I thought, oh, this would make a great, like the right half of this would make a great cover. And the thing that I like there's a lot of things I like about this photo, but probably the thing I like the most is that the nurse on the right is physically separated from, the men. And she looks sort of tentative, like she sort of wants to go over there, but maybe isn't allowed to go over there. And then they have these doctors doing doctory things there, and all these guys probably with their pipes and stuff up here. And then there's this sort of gruesome basin at the end of the table. The tables were sort of tilted, so the blood would sort of like filter down there. So I thought this is a really cool picture. But this was very clearly labeled as a Getty picture. Getty is one of these photo archives. They're very expensive. So I was like, okay, I can't do that. So I gave the cover designer several other pictures, including this one, which I didn't know was also a Getty photo. So it ended up being just as expensive for everybody. So that wasn't great, but I did give her this photo. And what I liked about this photo was the hats, the cupcakes. And then I gave her several other photos, but the artist decided that she liked this. So she was going to deliver me two options, and she took this photo and she made two options out of them, neither of which have the cupcakes on them. So that was sort of a bummer, but I did like the one on the right, which of course went on mostly to be was very close to what ended up to be the final cover. I thought that the one that's represented in the middle here was a little sort of Halloween-esque, but I know she was trying to go with this sort of medical gauze thing, but it looked a little more like the Mummy to me. So I don't know, this woman has a bit of a strange, posture here. So I liked this. I liked the color of the one in the middle more than this pinkish color. So ultimately, we sort of worked on that, and this is, the final cover. But I wanted to point out just two things that were my suggestions, my requests to the artist. And if you look carefully, you can see that there was some, she had a little plastic surgery here. So the original she has a little bit of a jowl there, and I had the artist sort of shave off a little bit of her, chin or jowl, because I wanted her to look younger. And also to try to make her look younger, she has a bit of like a poofy blouse here, and I wanted her to look a little bit thinner so that she would look younger. So I had the artist sort of shave off a bit of this blouse that was puffed out in the back and add a little contrast here. So there were some efforts to make this woman, who isn't old, but I really wanted to make her look quite young to match approximately the age of the protagonist. And the other thing that I wanted the artist to do, which is very small, nobody else would have noticed this, but I really like the fact that she has this thing hanging from her waist on a chain, which I believe is a tweezers. I wasn't exactly sure what she used. I think they may have used tweezers to remove like sort of used bandages and so forth, gauze and everything. And I had her sort of move it over so that it wasn't really colliding with the letter Y, because I just thought that was a really cool detail, because how clean could those tweezers have been if they were hanging from her waist, right? But yet she was using them for some medical purpose. And so I thought, well, that's sort of gross. So I wanted that to be featured a little bit more on the cover. So those were my tweaks. There's a couple other things. We moved the ornaments down here and so forth, but it was pretty close to the number 2 option that she had given me. So finally, the last thing I want to show you is that one of the things that my husband and I actually did for both my first book and this book is actually make a trailer. So I don't know if people knew, before I published a book, I did not know that books had trailers, but I knew movies had trailers. I didn't know books had trailers, but a trailer is something that a publicist can use to try to send out to people. It sort of takes the place of just reading a synopsis in a couple paragraphs, and it tells the story of the book this is a minute and a half. So I thought I would play it for you, and I hope the technology works here. So. Ta-da. So that is the show. Thanks so much for attending, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
That was so amazing. Thank you for doing that, for all those wonderful pictures. I was telling Connie that I just finished the book over the weekend, and it kept me riveted. And I was like, oh, 5 more pages. No, another 5 pages. And I finished it, I think, in 2 days because I wanted to find out the ending. So I do highly recommend it, especially for book clubs, because there's so much to discuss in it. And I think our book clubs at the Harrison Library and my other libraries that I also moderate book clubs would love the book. So much to discuss. So we are opening the floor to questions, and we're a small group. So if you'd like to unmute, that's fine. or if you want to type your question in the chat. It's okay that you haven't read the book. We were saying that we want this to sort of appeal to you and to make you want to read the book. So while you think of some questions, I have some questions for Connie. And, you know, it's not an easy read because it's a difficult subject, right? But you dealt with it so beautifully and so well. And as you mentioned, you have so many characters. Lillian's the main character, and some other strong antagonists in there, and then family members that she loves. Marie, her sister, who's deaf, right? And
She's
mute?
blind and mute.
Blind and mute. And her cousin Michael, who she is like a brother to her, and a whole number of other, I guess, what's the term when they're supporting characters. So which character did you find most difficult to write about?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me like which was my favorite. I haven't answered that, but which was most difficult to write? I would. I don't really have. I want to answer the other question about who's my favorite. I have to think about that. I really enjoyed writing the character of Lillian's patient that she ends up having troubles with, who's a Russian woman. And I think one of the great things about writing about turn of the century New York is you can have any nationality of person that you want as a character, because it was such, I mean, it still is, but it was, even back then, it was just such a melting pot. And so there's a lot of different, there's a lot of different people from all different walks of life. So I think that, you know, that was really fun to play with. And I really liked writing her. And I would say, I did have a little difficulties, a much more minor character of writing Lillian's mother, who you really only see sort of at the end. And that was a little tricky for me. So.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so I don't see any questions in the chat, so I will continue. Well, if you want to answer the question that you thought I was going to ask you, which was your favorite character?
Yeah, well, that was the Russian patient.
Oh, the Russian patient was.
She was just fun. I like to play with people's voices. I in a perfect world, I would write something between double quotes, and after a while you would know who it was without me having to identify it based on the slang that was used or the language or the Cades or whatever. And she was just fun. You know, she's got this heavy Russian accent, and it was just really fun to write her. And she's got this dry sense of humor. So I had the most fun there.
So you did so much extensive research for this book. And was there anything that surprised you while you were doing your research? You mentioned the whiskey, which I thought was pretty hysterical in a way, because I guess that was the best way to calm the patient. But I didn't realize they actually infused it into their veins. Was there anything else that you just uncovered that you weren't expecting?
Well, I wasn't expecting just the general use of whiskey as, all the different things that they used it for. I assumed that, pain, because they did, morphine's been around forever, and there are different ways to relieve pain, but whiskey was just a lot cheaper. And this place, the hospital had financial problems from the beginning. And I guess that was another thing that I discovered that I was not at all expecting was, so this hospital was funded with large donation by John Jacob Astor III, but he had a stipulation when he donated this money, which was that the money could be used for building the building, but it could not be used for ongoing expenses like salaries and food and buying beds and so forth. And so it really tied their hands a lot. And they had financial troubles from pretty much from the first day that they opened, because they could not use any of the funds that they were getting from the Astor family for this. And there are these annual reports that show what the costs were when people donated, like 3 quilts and, 2 jars of jam. I mean, they really sort of went down to the penny as sort of accounting for all of these things. And you could see that there were 2 different levels of payment that a patient could potentially pay. You could have the rich person price, where you got sort of a rich person's treatment, and you could have the poor person's price. And so I believe if you could afford it, you could have your room by yourself for $20 a week. And if you couldn't, if you were either there for free or you paid $5 a week. So I'm sure there was a lot of difference in the quality of your care as well. And it's sort of in the book, you may remember, I sort of talk about, well, there's actually even 2 types of linens. There's sort of the rougher linens and the nice linens. And some nurse gets in trouble because she mixes up the linens, and some rich person got the rough linens, and whatever. So very classist. So I've been told that there are hospitals also today that still cater, there's like the rich person's ward. If you're a movie star or whatever, and you have your plastic surgery, you can go to some special place that you and I will never be able to see, so
So the champagne, afternoon champagne and the carriage rides for the
Yes.
upper class, that was
for
true
sure,
too.
and was documented. So for people who haven't read the book, if you were there being treated for cancer and you were well enough, you could have champagne cocktails in the parlor downstairs, and you could go for these carriage rides in Central Park, which is sort of right outside the door. And that was not part of the $5 a week payment.
No.
So there were, and I think that was, I mean, most of this was really palliative care, because what would happen is, you would be admitted, you'd have surgery almost always resulted in infection. They didn't have a really good way of treating that. And so you were in the hospital for a long time. I mean, the surgical notes that I showed that said that person was there for a month, that was pretty typical, and it was typical to have actually end up having multiple surgeries, because your wound would be infected. You'd have to go in, and they would sort of like try to get rid of the infected stuff and patch you up or whatever. So it was pretty brutal. So you spend a lot of time there. You weren't in for 2 days, you were in for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So I think they had to sort of entertain some of these people, and that was maybe where the carriage rides came in for the rich people.
And then the same with the patients, once they were sort of cured, maybe still had medical issues, but were cured, were they actually then transferred to Blackwell Island, the insane asylum?
No, so that was something that was reserved for people who just were not. So in the book, it's a little bit of a spoiler alert, but if you had complications from your surgery, so you no longer were having cancer, but you had other problems related to what happened to you in the hospital, I think they would try to turf you out to different places, which could be Blackwell Island, or could be other places that were a lot worse than New York Cancer Hospital. So that's definitely what you don't want to happen while you're in there. You want to try to walk out of that place.
What was the percentage of people who had surgery survived?
That would be great if they had tracked that, but I don't think there are no statistics on tracking that, because I don't think the statistics were very good. But I mean, even if you developed infection, like your body ultimately sometimes can fight this off. And so, people avoided the hospital. This is sort of a circular problem here, because people would avoid the hospital because all hospitals had sort of a bad reputation at this time. Because why? Because people died in hospitals. And so what would happen is, somebody who had cancer, if you had a lump in your breast, you'd probably put it off until you just had no alternative. So you're coming to the hospital looking for surgery, for treatment, when you are late stage, right? And as we all know, that is not when you want to start having treatment. And so it was sort of a self-perpetuating thing that they had bad statistics. They probably could have had better statistics if that patient had come when she first discovered the lump, but that's not really what people did. A lot of people didn't go at all. And so that was another factor in why the statistics were not very good.
But they knew so little at the time.
Yeah, they knew how to, because all they could do is cut. They they cut they cut just as much as they could. I mean, this was sort of the trend at the time, was that they were discovering if they cut a little bit more and a little bit more, and they took more out, that they had slightly better outcomes, right? Because your margins and so forth. But they just sort of, would do these things that were sort of, disfiguring and really problematic for people's lives after, if they were lucky enough to get out of the hospital. What kind of life could they have when they lost the function of their arm, or they lost their leg, or whatever? So they did tend to do very radical surgeries back then.
We have a question in the chat from Darby. What kind of training the nurses get?
So right around this time, there were nurse training schools, sort of for the first time in the last, I want to say like 10 years or just so forth. So being a full-fledged nurse, you did have to go to nursing school, and that was relatively new. And a lot of this was inspired by Florence Nightingale, who really took nursing from a not very admired profession, and because of a lot of things that she did, and also how she was a very sort of holier than thou. She was a very upright, moral person. She really turned the nursing career into something that was respectable. And so that inspired these nursing schools. So now families would allow their daughters to become nurses, so they would have the nursing schools could support that. But it was typical that nurses would live at the hospital and would live at these nursing programs. And then, you could sort of keep an eye on them and make sure that they were living in a morally good life and so forth. And so in my story, my main character is actually a nursing assistant, which I'm not sure if that actually existed. I made that up actually, because there's reasons why the story would not work if she lived at the hospital, but all the other nurses have to live at the hospital, and they're under the watchful eye of people at the hospital, the matron and so forth. So it was, you had to really be on the straight and narrow if you wanted to do that.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions in the chat, but you're welcome. If anyone would like to unmute and ask a question, I will ask another question, because there are a lot of scenes that really leave an impression on the reader. At least they left an impression on me. Were there any, the scope of your research, I'm sure, was quite extensive. Were there any scenes that you initially wanted to include that didn't make it to the final draft?
I feel like what I ended up doing is just adding, although people tell me that, you can see it's not a very big book. So if you don't like really big books, it's pretty slim, but a lot happens in there. And I felt like I was adding, characters that I wasn't really planning on initially. I don't know that I cut a lot of ideas out. I definitely did that with my first book. And I am really interested in, as has been mentioned, Lillian's sister, has disabilities. She's blind and mute. And I have always been interested in stories about people with disabilities 100 years ago. Like, how did that even work? Like, how did you care for people? How were people diagnosed? How were they viewed by other people? And so one of the things I wanted to put in my first book, which is also set in Boston, but also the turn of the century, was I thought it'd be really interesting to have somebody with OCD, because I sort of believe that all these things that are somewhat prevalent now, probably people have had these things. They're not new, most of them, So I thought that would be really interesting. But then when I started writing that character, I was so interested in it. He was supposed to be this real, like, sort of almost a throwaway character. And I got like too interested, and then I thought, this is a distraction. So he actually is just a boy who has selective mutism, and it's never explained like why he has this, but that's just his thing, and he's accepted by his friends and everything. But I feel like maybe my next book I might go with that OCD thing. So because I don't know, I just think it would be really interesting to and that and other disabilities, and that's really was part of why Marie is a character that has these issues.
So yes, I guess you're promoting this book now, so it feels strange to ask you what are you working on next, but you sort of answered that to some extent. And I really liked how the ending is a bit open-ended in terms of the next path for Lillian, where she'll end up. Would you ever consider writing a sequel or to continue her story, maybe 10 years from
Yeah.
now?
So
Or the
I know that the book, when I wrote the ending, I'm like, I didn't intend it to be, here comes the sequel. But I realized, oh, this really could make you think that I'm trying to set you up for a sequel. But really what I was trying to do, so Lillian is 19 years old during the story. And she, like many teenagers, I had two of them, sees the world in very black and white terms. And she comes into the story sort of feeling like she can handle all, like whatever's coming at her from the hospital, that she knows she can handle it. And then ultimately sort of she really can't handle it, right? Because it's the stuff is like way over her head. And so I wanted the ending to be that that she's unsure of her future, and that's okay with her, as opposed to in the beginning, she's just like, going gangbusters in one direction, whether it's a good idea or not, So I hoped, that during the story that you see the evolution of the growth of this character going from sort of a bit of a teenager mindset to a more mature mindset. So I don't know. I think my next book is not planned to be a sequel for this book, to answer your question directly. So.
No, I was just curious because I would like to know, because you have so many interesting social issues that come up in the book, and that are relatable today. Let's say, things that still, can maybe not considered taboo, but just things that people would make more notice of. And this is 1890s, and how she's very brave. She's very courageous, Lillian. And I admire that about her. And she doesn't maybe follow the path that you would think she would follow in terms of her decisions. And she's very open-minded, and she does become friends with Jupiter, which I really love that friendship there. But they had to be very careful because that could be explosive, because he's Black American, and I guess she's of Irish descent. So I liked how that was part of the story as well. It didn't detract.
That might be actually my answer to your first question about who's the most difficult character to write. And I think it would actually, now I think about it, it would probably be Jupiter, because it's just difficult. You want to be culturally sensitive, but you also want to be historically realistic. And when writing an African-American character, when you are not African-American, I think, I guess I would say I was nervous writing that character, although I felt strongly that his presence in the book really means something. And I wasn't nervous enough that I was going to ever consider taking him out. But my book did go through like a sensitivity read, and some of the things, that there was not much flagged, but there's one comment where Michael, the cousin, makes a comment about something about your dark friend or your dark prince, and my editor was like, nope, and I was like, really dark, bad, but I was like, whatever you think, that's fine, because my intention is just not to offend people, and I'm just doing the best that I can. But it's a little bit of a tricky time, to write these things, but you do have to have a little bit of courage, if you want to get something across. So I, cross your fingers that I did okay.
Well, I think you did okay, and I would think most readers would agree. So Swedish says, thank you so much. Very interesting. She's joining us from the Tuckahoe Library tonight. And we have time for one more question. If anyone would like to put something in the chat, or if anyone would like to unmute. I know a number of our book club members are here tonight, and I don't think any of them have read it. Our copy is at the library if anyone would like to borrow it. And I think we'd find so much to discuss with this. With the book, you've given us so much to think about and learn about, because I really had no idea about the New York Cancer Hospital and how it was.
Neither did I.
Neither did I.
So I love that it's informational, but also entertaining, in the sense that it's a gripping read, and it does touch your heartstrings, different things that happen throughout the story, right? That affects the characters.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I read almost exclusively historical fiction, and I always consider it painless learning. If a really good historical fiction, you should just be like, this was really fun to read. Oh, and by the way, I learned so much about nuclear physics, or
Yeah.
like something that you would never pick up a textbook and read, but then you learn
Right.
something. That's my favorite thing. I would read books all day long if I could just keep learning that way. So
We have Louis Pasteur mentioned and Dr. Lister from
Yep.
Listerine. So I thought, oh, this is so cool. And I'm making little notations. So
Yep.
I guess that's your favorite genre to read as well, historical fiction. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to a fault, I have trouble reading contemporary books sometimes, because usually if you're reading historical fiction, there's there's a war, there's like it's a plague, or whatever, and then if I start to read a book about somebody in the suburbs is unhappy in their marriage and they want a divorce or whatever, and I'm like, oh, come on, have
Right.
a real problem, so that which is terrible, because there's probably some excellent books that are written about women who are getting divorced in the suburbs,
Right.
but I just have problems with that.
You
So
want something
read
with
a lot
more
of stuff.
substance, and I can
Yeah.
understand that.
I want big problems.
Well, this one tackles big problems.
Big problems.
Big problems. And I hope we get to, if the book club would like to read it, I hope that you would be able to come back, and they might have more questions for you once they've read it and how the characters developed. And I loved that you had your chart there with how often the characters should be included.
Showing up. Yeah.
That is so analytical to have it like that. And that's your background, right? Systems.
Yeah. It's my paying job, as I like to say. So yeah. So that worked out well. I always solve all problems with a spreadsheet now. So
I'm just curious, and I'll make this our last question. Since you have a full-time job, when do you find time to write? When's your inspirational period for you?
Well, for this book, I started writing it right when my daughter went off to college. I had like a little extra time. And so I developed a schedule that I loosely stuck with, which was, and I knew that I had to start exercising more, because of my job, I sit, and I'm writing, you're sitting, and I thought my body was just going to fall apart. So I would sort of work out in the morning, and then like 9 to 11, I would write, and then like 11 to 6, I would work, because I was like at 25 hours a week. I wasn't full time. So I was fortunate enough to be able to do that. So writing's definitely easier for me in the morning. I do everything a little better in the morning. So that worked for me pretty well. But I can't ever stick to it too strictly. And then I try not to, because then I'll just start berating myself. And you have to sit in the chair from 9 to 11, and then I don't do it, and then I feel so guilty. So I let myself do whatever I want. But that was my basic structure to get through this. And I also had a writing partner, and we would review each other's chapters. She was also writing historical fiction, so she kept me on the mark too. So I always need some structure to keep me organized and keep me going and motivated.
Very good. Very good. So, well, hopefully when we get to reading the book as a group for discussion, I know you have ties to Westchester. Maybe we could even welcome you in person, which would be
great. I really love doing events in person. Right now I'm doing like outdoor, like book groups that are like on somebody's patio or whatever. Totally fine with that. Indoors, it's a little dicey up here, so,
yeah.
But everybody's hoping for some more normalcy. So, but I would love to do Zoom, and I would love to come down. I come down to Westchester somewhat regularly because my family is still there.
Oh,
so
nice.
I'd be happy to do whatever makes sense at the time.
Sure. Well, we have it on recording, so we will be asking you back. And I wanted to mention to everyone that the book is available for purchase as well at the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville. And I put the link in the chat. And I think we had, or we're arranging for you to either get signed book plates to the bookstore. So I would highly recommend the book. And we do have a copy in the library, but once that's checked out, you have to wait to get it to read it, which it's worth the wait. But I do suggest that you also support our local businesses and our local bookstores as well. So
I'm very into that. But if you're an e-reader or if a Kindle reader, you can actually get it in like Kobo and Kindle and a couple other formats. But if you're doing hard copy, I'm always about the local independent bookstores. So Village Bookstore is great. So
yeah. So I just wanted to put that plug in as well. And I will stop our recording for tonight. I wanted to thank Connie for joining us and sharing her the the inspiration and the research that was involved in putting this book together. And I think it's just fantastic.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.